It's finally time to make another video about the Switch 2 sales in Japan. The whole discussion around the Switch 2's apparent success in Japan has been kind of a roller coaster ever since, really, the April Direct. Initially, the demand for pre-orders was so large that it prompted experts all around the world to release articles about how the Switch 2 is expected to sell between 6 to 8 million units at launch. Obviously, we saw fewer than 4 million. And then once the console did launch in Japan, the very reliable Famitsu data that Nintendo fans hold onto and keep close to their chest as much as they possibly can, indicated that the console had reached almost 1 million units on its opening week. And that momentum continued quite a bit up until the end of July, where the assumption was that the Switch 2 was very close to reaching 2 million units sold in Japan. During that run, we got articles about how it was the fastest selling console launch, how it was outpacing the Game Boy Advance and the PlayStation 2. There was all of this initial momentum being built off of these numbers. Headlines being spilled out that would affect the general perception of the console's launch, as well as even affect the discourse here and no doubt investors' confidence in Nintendo's launch. And it actually made a lot of sense to me. And this is why I spent a large part of June and July talking about just how successful the Switch 2 was. And more importantly, how proportional the success was in Japan in comparison to the rest of the world. And this was a very important talking point because the Nintendo Switch 2 is roughly $100 cheaper, if not more, in Japan. Actually, it's certainly more than $100 cheaper because in Japan, the price that we see is the actual sales price final. In the US, it's after tax. So we're paying significantly more dollars over here than they are over there. By the end of the Switch 1's life, roughly 1 in every 5 people that bought a Switch were from Japan. During that first month and a half of data that we saw, it was almost 1 in every 3, showing that there was much more favor for the Switch 2 in Japan than anywhere else in the world. And I discussed this quite a bit in a lot of videos. And many people agreed. It made a lot of sense. In Japan, Nintendo did not betray their customer base. They appropriately priced the Switch 2 based off of its actual market value, and effectively had the rest of the world pay more for their console, significantly more for the console, while discounting their home base. And to be clear, I don't think they should increase the price for the people in Japan. Rather, I think it's important that they decrease the prices elsewhere. Now, this discussion and hype about how well the Switch 2 was doing continued up until we got the first quarterly financials, which we got on the 1st of August, I believe, and the information on there covered all of the Switch 2 sales up until the end of June. This saw that all of the success we saw in Japan for the Switch 2's launch was actually completely false. Famitsu, the company that everybody used as a source in order to deliver how great the Switch 2 launch was doing, actually overtracked the Switch 2 enough to the point where it was not the fastest selling console. The reality was the Game Boy Advance was doing better, and eventually even the PlayStation 2 had surpassed the Nintendo Switch 2. But because of that initial launch hype and all of the headlines that were spread around initially during the incorrect data that was being shared, it was very much too late. The damage had been done, and the narrative had been set. Now, because of this incorrect data, I actually pivoted as to how well the Switch 2 was doing in Japan. The reality was throughout the entire world, by that point in time, we're looking at early August now, the Switch 2 was readily available, it was sitting on shelves, and this was still early enough in the console's life where people were in denial about this and they said it doesn't mean anything. This was around the time where I made a lot of videos about how people all over the world were saying the Switch 2s are just sitting on their shelves and not moving the same way they did in that opening launch weekend. This was around the same point in time where we were looking at how much scalpers were not making off of the Switch 2. All of these were clear indicators of diminishing demand. And since this was happening around the entire world, and Nintendo was actually delivering very few weekly units to Japan, I wrongfully made an assumption that the Switch 2 demand in Japan must be like it is in the rest of the world. And I've admitted to being wrong about this. Because I'm not afraid to admit when I'm wrong about something. The problem is that I am seldom wrong about anything, so that's why it doesn't happen often. Sorry, that line was there for the haters. Now, in addition to the global patterns I saw with the Switch 2 launch, there are more reasons as to why I assumed the demand for the Switch 2 in Japan was much smaller than we expected. I've made a lot of videos about the software sales numbers in Japan. All of those videos I was completely right about. Any data that I've shared about how poor one of the Nintendo Switch 2's game launches are, those are all valid and nothing's changed about those. Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 has only recently surpassed, in 3 months of its life, the launch weekend of the Wii U's 3D World, which was the second worst launch Mario game. And likewise, Pokemon Legends ZA ended up being outpaced by Pokemon Legends Arceus in Japan, even though it had a better launch weekend. And now, obviously, Legends ZA has surpassed it, primarily because that game was launched in January, and this one is getting their Christmas bump right now. Plus, it is a bundled title, which means that people in Japan that want a Switch Switch 2, some of them are forced to buy the Pokemon game, but that doesn't change the fact that during the time of the launch when I was discussing those stuff, that data is all correct. None of that has been wrong, and I was not wrong about any of it. I just want to make sure that's clear because right now I'm only clarifying the discussion about the hardware Switch 2 consoles sold, not about the software. So what I found very weird was that Nintendo was shipping an excessive amount of consoles everywhere worldwide except for in Japan. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, well, clearly if they wanted to make sure they reached their sales goals, they would be shipping more units to Japan. Plus, I started following Japanese forums. Many people were talking about how much easier it was to grab a Switch 2 as opposed to a PS5. Many of them were saying that if somebody was willing to drive out a fair distance, they'd find Switch 2s that would sit on shelf for a week. So it made sense to me. Maybe the Nintendo Switch 2 was not as in demand in Japan as I thought, as the whole world thought. After all, there were some weeks where the Nintendo Switch 1 and the PS5 were selling only like 10 or 15,000 units fewer than the Nintendo Switch 2, which got me to cheekily say that, hey, there's not out of the realm of possibility for the Switch 1 to outsell the Switch 2 in one of these weeks, especially when you consider that right now during the holiday season, the Switch 1 is selling so well in Japan that it might actually be close to the Switch 2 numbers in the United States, for the holidays at least. So basically, I just figured that the Switch 2 in Japan was doing the same thing it was doing in Europe and the rest of the world and the United States especially, which is that it was a console that was grossly over-exaggerated as to how much it was wanted, sold very well initially because Nintendo delayed its launch in order to have excessive stock, so they stockpiled to make their launch get all the headlines, and then the demand fell off very sharply. But the reality is that was not the case. In actuality, what occurred was that Nintendo clearly was not shipping enough units to Japan to meet the demand over there. And there are a few very obvious reasons as to why. Nintendo's business model with the Switch 2 has clearly been to find success in the same ways that Sony's PlayStation 5 did. One of those things is to try to grab as many third-party developers that make AAA titles and court them to the best of their ability in order so that they can make more money off of software sales without releasing as many first-party titles. Another way is to find ways to incentivize and force people to go digital as much as possible, and that includes the upgrade pack. It includes DLC, it includes everything that involves Nintendo Switch Online, and most importantly, it even includes game key cards, because as Sony and even Xbox has showed us, having a higher digital rate is much better for a game to make more money, to the point where it actually sometimes might be better to have fewer sales if most of them are digital, as opposed to having more sales that are physical. And finally, the third way Nintendo has been trying to piggyback off of the PlayStation 5 success in the early launch days has been to kind of put Japan on a back burner and try to gain the market elsewhere. This is a very big reason why the other category that we see on the Nintendo Switch 2 financials is much larger than it's ever been before, because Nintendo has been sending out their units to all of these markets around the world that normally would not even give Nintendo so much as a single thought. I'm talking places around the Middle East, Latin America. These are all consoles that made their way to these markets. They were significantly overpriced, and even with all of their price drops, they haven't really been sold in these markets, because those areas around the globe are where people just buy a PlayStation 5 and FIFA, and that's it. They don't need anything else. Okay, that's a little bit of a generalized exaggeration, but not as much as you might think. Plus, in fairness, I can make the same type of over-exaggerated generalization and say that everybody in the States just plays Call of Duty, Fortnite, and Madden, and I might actually be onto something. In any case, so we saw very clearly that pretty much through most of the first 6 months of the Switch 2's life, Nintendo significantly deprioritized Japan. They sent them units, but until now, they have very likely not satiated demand. And they have the units. They've overshipped everywhere else in the world. But in Japan, it's clearly artificial scarcity. They've increased demand by limiting supply, and they can get away with it in Japan because the retailers play by their rules. With the reports in Japan indicating that retailers had to limit the amount of time that they can sell the Switch 2 and how many units they can release on a week-by-week basis, and this was all justified by them claiming it was a way for them to combat scalpers. But the reality is, even very early on, it was very obvious that despite all of these ways that they tried to implement a combat against the scalpers were still very much scooping up the Switch 2s and selling them online. The resale market in Japan was very healthy for the Switch 2, and the scalpers until now are grabbing those consoles and selling them online and making a crap ton of money off of them. Again, when there's high demand for something, this is what the natural market does. Very unlike anything we saw with the Switch 2 everywhere outside of Japan. So even though there was high demand for the Switch 2 in Japan, these games that they've played have caused the demand to be even higher. And it's made it so that there's just been this need for anybody to find any way they can get a hold of the Switch 2 in Japan, and it's pretty much identical to the experience that all of us saw in the first 2 or 3 years of the PS5 and the Xbox Series console's lifespan. And I want to shed some light on that because many people assume that that was only a result of a global pandemic, and that's the only reason there was high demand for those consoles. I think the fact that we're still seeing that experience in Japan is proof that that's not the case. And likewise, I think the fact that we saw the NEX Playground getting scalped and soiled on eBay for twice what it's worth is also proof that this can still happen in the States. The reason it did not happen in the States is because there was not enough demand for the Switch 2 in the States for it to happen. And you can argue it's a supply thing, but I've gone through many videos showing that the Switch 2 did not reach enough units sold to customers for it to completely fall off in that type of demand. As a matter of fact, the Switch 2 is very close to reaching 4 million sales in Japan. And depending on how December went in the United States, there's a very likely chance that the Switch 2 reaches 4 million in Japan prior to when it does in the States. And still, in Japan, the demand is not satiated. So this actually completely takes us full circle, because since the holidays started, the Switch 2 has gotten a crazy amount of units in Japan, and every single one of them are selling out. They love it over there. And of course they do. It's like $350. A $399 Switch 2 at launch would have created that same type of demand over here, especially if that was the bundled price. So it's actually kind of funny because I was wrong about what was going on in Japan between the months of like August and September, but now I'm even more vindicated than I was back in June and July. I should have just stuck with my gut instinct. That's what I did with the States. That's how I knew that the holiday was going to be terrible for Nintendo over here. But in fairness, I live here. I know how the market works over here. It makes a lot of sense to me. The patterns were all very much pointing towards a weak holiday season for the Switch 2 in the States, because the unfortunate reality is, whether or not you guys want to admit it, consoles sitting on shelves this early into its lifespan and money not being made by scalpers this early into its lifespan, and I'm not only talking about a function of time, I'm talking about a function of units sold as well. Like I've been saying for over 6 months now, it's a very bad sign. It's a clear indication that the demand is just not there. But like I said, I live here. I know how Americans are. I know how we consume things. So I stuck with my gut feeling, even though over time, different sales reports and articles would lead people to think that I was wrong, and it would have been very easy for me to fold, but I knew I was right, so I didn't feel a need to back down. In Japan, I backed down on my initial thoughts because I don't know the Japanese market. Not as much as this one anyway. So early on, I folded. I'm like, you know what? Maybe the demand that I thought that was there in Japan is not there, and it's the same as the rest of the world. But no, it's exactly what I expected early on. Put it this way. Based off of the numbers that we've seen so far, it seems like they've shipped roughly 1.5 times the amount of units to the United States as they have to Japan. They've delivered significantly more to the US. And despite that major difference of how many more they've sent to the US in comparison to Japan, the numbers are just about tied right now. And the way that it's going, it shows that if you were to send another 1 or 2 million to Japan tomorrow, those might sell out by the end of the weekend, which is a very clear and obvious indicator as a location where the Switch 2 is in demand versus a location where the Switch 2 is not in demand. And this is exactly what my initial instincts were leading up to the launch of the Switch 2, as well as what we saw during the initial sales in June and July. So my initial gut instinct and my initial tracking was completely correct. The reality is, what we all assumed from the beginning before this thing launched, giving Japan a cheaper console and having the rest of the world subsidize the price of it for those local Japanese markets, has made the Switch 2 launch in Japan what you would have expected worldwide up until this point. The Switch 2 should still be selling out. It actually should reach satiated demand like this week. This is what it should have happened in the States, and that's probably close to what's happening in Japan. Although honestly, it might bleed over, and I'm thinking that there's going to be a big drop-off after the holidays, because I don't know if they have enough units to satiate everybody that wants it over there. But over here with the Switch 2, everybody expected that it would be sold out off of shelves until the end of the year. There still would have been consoles being shipped, they would have come into the stores, and they would have gotten sold within a day or two. That's not what happened. We were all here watching that. And the reason this is what we all assumed is because that's what happened with the Nintendo Switch 1. And that's why when Christmas came around in the United States, it sold 775,000 in the holiday season and then 1.5 million in December. This is what we all predicted the Switch 2 would be able to do, or at least get close to. It managed fewer than 500,000 units in November, and it could be like much lower than that, by the way. Like I'm predicting it's around 440,000, because the reality is that it was so bad that Circana did not tell us how many units were sold. Instead, they grouped it in with the Switch 1 numbers. And you know something is not doing well when they don't share that data and they make it as vague as possible. I mean, for all I know, during the Black Friday sales, many people could have gone to the store and saw the Switch 1 available, and like 150,000 people could have bought that. That would take the Switch 2 as low as 400,000. But the point is that they did not share those numbers because of how bad it did. And it's going to be the same thing in December. We're going to see that when we get the numbers for December on January 17th. December could outsell November here in the States. I don't know yet because I'm waiting for the end of the month so I can tally up my data and make a prediction. But to reiterate, back in 2017, the Switch 1 sold 775,000 in November and then 1.5 million in December. That's almost 2.3 million for the Switch 1 in November and December. And the Switch 2 is going to be lucky to hit 1 million between those two, just to give you an idea of how poor it's doing over here. But obviously in Japan, that's not the case. And everything you're seeing in Japan is what was expected by everybody across the board here in the States. They've just simply moved the goalpost as time has gone on. Prior to the console's launch, they said that you would be hard-bent to even be able to find a Switch 2 anywhere in stores. It's going to be difficult to grab until the holidays. And we quickly saw that was not the case, up until like the second week. And then even up until the end of July, people were talking about how scalpers were going to be making a killing off of the Switch 2s because of how in demand the console is, and how everybody was supposed to hold hands and agree together that we were not going to buy from the scalpers because they're not going to win this time. And then it turns out that the scalpers lost before the console even launched because Nintendo launched it at the scalper price instead of the price that it's supposed to go for. Nintendo outscalped the scalpers. So we quickly saw they were wrong about that as well. And what did the Nintendo fans say? They said that Nintendo provided enough stock and that's why, and it's not going to translate to anything, and this just means that Nintendo has a lot available. But I knew that was wrong and I covered it extensively on my channel. And I said we're going to see this reflected in the holidays. And then they kept insisting that there is no chance that the Switch 2 would ever get a discount. They said it over and over again. They were saying it before the console launched. They were saying it when the discounts happened in Europe and talking about loss leaders. And they kept saying here in the States, there is zero chance in hell you will ever find a Switch 2 for anything less than its launch price. And they just kept talking about it over and over and over again. Even through Black Friday week, Nintendo fans were adamant that it was impossible that the Switch 2 would get a price drop or a discount from anybody. And then they were wrong about it on Cyber Monday when we saw that Walmart was selling it for cheaper. And then when Walmart did it, Amazon followed, Best Buy followed, and Target followed. And then they insisted that it was only being done because they were trying to be loss leaders and it was a product that was very much in demand and that it was not a clear indicator of a console not selling well. They said it was just a Cyber Monday deal, even though that makes no sense because Nintendo consoles do not go on a discount like that out of nowhere. And that only happens when something is not selling well. But Nintendo fans kept shifting the narrative as much as they possibly can throughout this entire time frame. And then after like the 2 weeks of Cyber Monday when the consoles stopped being on discount, they said it wasn't going to go back anymore and you missed the sales. And this past week, it was still discounted in Best Buy, Amazon, everywhere, $450 for a Switch 2 bundle with Mario Kart. That's $50 off. And some retailers were even selling the base model for $400, making it the cheapest the Switch 2 has been since launched in the most in-demand time frame. And they completely insisted that it had nothing to do with poor sales until we saw the Circana data and we saw just how terrible the Switch 2 was doing in November. And still, despite all of these signs and all of the time that Switch 2 fans have been wrong and incorrect throughout the past 6 months, now they're insisting that it's just the economy. And they're once again insisting that the price is going to go up next year. Even this week, during the holidays, when the Switch 2 still dropped in price, days before Christmas, they still think it has nothing to do with how poor this console is doing and how nothing to do with the fact that people do not want it. And they still think that the price is going to go up next year, even though people are not buying it. But the reality is there is one location where people are buying it, and those are the types of sales patterns we should have seen around the entire world. Listen, I don't like supply shortages. I don't like stock issues. I don't like that scalpers take advantage of people that aren't able to grab consoles. I've gone through this in depth, but I'm also not stupid. I understand the basic concepts of supply and demand. The reality is, in locations where something is high in demand, you see everything that's currently been seen in Japan for the past 6 months. That's what it looks like when something is hyped up and high in demand. And we have not seen that anywhere else, including on the initial launch weekend of the Switch 2. Most consoles sell out on day 1. It took a whole weekend for the Switch 2 to sell out because there were so many people out there that were like, what do you mean this thing's in stock and I'm never gonna be able to buy it later? Okay, fine, let me go grab it. And then like 3 days after the console launched, they decided to go buy it and it was there. But the people that were willing to line up and grab a Switch 2 because they absolutely had to have it, they weren't there on day 1 because that number is not that high. That's what happens with the consoles that are high in demand. That's what happened with all the PlayStation consoles and Xbox consoles and even the Switch 1. The signs were there very early on. And I have extensively covered all of those things along the way. Famitsu is the only thing Nintendo fans can currently grab onto. That's it. There's no other safe haven for them. And I hope Nintendo reaches its 19 million forecast by the end of this year. And I really am excited to see the sold through numbers, because they're going to show that there's a 100% sell-through rate in Japan and a much lower sell-through rate everywhere else. And they might have to ship enough to Japan to completely make it the highest shipments in the world, because otherwise they might not reach that forecast. We could be very well looking at something remarkable, a record for the Switch 2, a record for Nintendo. A console launches and it's selling much better in Japan than it is everywhere else in the world, which would be a clear sign of how much favor Nintendo has lost with the rest of the world, because they decided to rip everybody else off. Whereas in Japan, all they did was continue on with the amazing momentum they had from the Switch 1. All of those feelings and those heel turns that we've seen from the Nintendo faithful from the start of April until now, all of those ice-breaking moments and those glass-shattering moments where we realize that Nintendo is completely making the fool of us and trying to rip us off and laugh at us with the launch of the Switch 2 because they assume that we'll give them $1 for everything, even if it's not worth a penny. All of those drawbacks and reservations do not exist in Japan because Nintendo is not ripping them off over there. And if they hadn't tried to do the same thing to everybody over here back in April, you would be seeing Switch 2s unavailable off of shelves and people jumping over each other in order to get a hold of their console, and Nintendo would have 100% released a tweet sometime in the past week or so talking about how the Switch 2 has officially sold through 15 million units, or whatever that number is, 12 or 13 million units, and we all would have collectively celebrated because Nintendo was more successful than it was with the Switch 1 in its first year. Because back in 2017, it was mid-December when Nintendo released a tweet saying they reached 10 million, and we were all so happy to see it. But not this time. I don't think we'll ever get a sold-through number from Nintendo at this rate. But hey, at least a small minority of Switch 2 buyers in the West can always lean back on the Famitsu numbers in Japan and grasp onto those numbers like it's their holy grail, because they're not going to find that same type of comfort and confidence in Nintendo's success elsewhere. Not to the same extent that we saw with the Switch 1's life when the Nintendo fans were standing behind the Switch. But instead, this time around, at least half of us have turned away from the Switch 2.